Welcome everybody to Contemporary Issues class. Thank you. What a great group we have today, and we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Randall Balmer today to talk about God in the White House, faith of the presidents, how it impacted society and their election and their performance. So a great topic for us as we talk about social things. Welcome to first timers. If anybody's here for the first time, I'm Steve. Thanks for coming. I'm the leader of our class. And before I introduce Dr. Balmer further, I want to do our usual announcements. Want to check if Zoomers can hear us okay. Shelly, I see you. Can you hear us okay? Good. Okay. And please mute yourself, Zoomers, in the lower left corner of your screen when you're not talking, so we can keep the background noise down. And we are recording this for future playback on the internet for folks who want to see it later, weren't able to be with us today. We always do that. And we want to take questions and comments today, Dr. Balmer, while you're speaking or after you're speaking. Either one's okay. Okay. And because we are talking about political issues again today, please be kind in your comments and recognize that we have folks on both sides of the political spectrum here. And we are a church that wants to be respectful of each other's opinions and political persuasion. So please keep that in mind. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Balmer. First, Vicki has an announcement about a Christmas party coming up, our class Christmas party.
Yes, so it's going to be Monday, December 5th at 6 o'clock here at the church. And we're not asking you to bring anything. We're just asking for a $5 donation per person. And we're going to have Italian. I think we're going to have lasagna and baked ziti and a big salad and some bread and dessert and punch and tea and coffee. So anyway, 6 o'clock, and let us know if you're coming so we can kind of get a head count. Also, we will do our white elephant gift exchange, and there will be some guessing games and stuff like that. So it's always a lot of fun, and we really enjoy it. So we're trying at the church this year, and we'll provide the food. So just a $5 donation. So that's it. So just let Steve know if you're coming.
Sometimes in class, we also take a few minutes to talk about current things in the news from a Christian perspective, but we're not going to do that today, except I will mention, let's keep in mind prayers for the shooting that was last night in Colorado Springs, killed 5 people and wounded 18 at a gay bar. Very sad if you haven't heard that in today's news. They don't know details about why it happened, but another sad incident for Colorado and for everywhere. Okay, Dr. Balmer is a historian of American religion and has his own Wikipedia page too. He's also an Episcopal priest, earned his PhD from Princeton. He's been a visiting professor at Dartmouth and at Rutgers. He's also taught at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and a visiting professor at Yale Divinity School. He's previously served as a part-time rector of 2 Episcopal churches in Connecticut. And in addition to his academic writing, he's been published in newspapers across the country. I won't list them all. Dr. Balmer's been nominated for an Emmy for script writing and hosting a 3-part PBS documentary called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, based on his book by the same title. He also wrote and hosted 2 other PBS documentaries, one called Crusade, The Life of Billy Graham, and In the Beginning, The Creationist Controversy. So with that, please welcome Dr. Balmer.
Thank you, Steve. I'm delighted to be here. This is really quite a place, and thank you, Joan, for making this possible. Joan and I were in high school together.
Just a few years ago.
Some years ago. Let's just leave it there, okay? And we reconnected recently, and this is how I came to be here. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. The topic for this session is religion and the presidency, and I wrote a book a few years ago called God in the White House, and I have to say that I haven't read it for a while, so I've forgotten a lot of it, but I've been trying to page through it a little bit. But I began the book with John Kennedy, which I thought was probably a good place to start. So let's start with that and talk about how faith and religion has affected the presidency throughout these various administrations. First of all, the 1960 campaign, as some of you may know or may remember, was quite contested because this was only the second time in American history that a Roman Catholic had won the nomination of a major political party for the president. The first time, of course, was 1928, when Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York, and Roman Catholic, secured the Democratic nomination to run against Herbert Hoover, the Republican nominee. This was a time in the 1920s when there was a recrudescence of the Ku Klux Klan. This is really the second iteration of the Klan. The first came, of course, after Reconstruction, or after the Civil War. And then the second iteration of the Klan expanded the list of Klan enemies to foreign-born Jews and Roman Catholics. And so when Alfred Smith was mounting his campaign for the presidency, there was a lot of resistance. Ku Klux Klan rallies that were held in otherwise respectable places in order to try to dissuade Americans from electing a Catholic to the presidency. As you know, the outcome, Alfred Smith did not win. He lost overwhelmingly to Herbert Hoover. According to popular lore at the time, when the results came in, Smith sent a one-word telegram to the Vatican, said, "Unpack." So as the junior senator from Massachusetts was thinking about running for president in 1960, he had to face the whole issue of Roman Catholicism and American politics. Kennedy had tried to make himself marketable as a presidential candidate in the 1956 campaign. During the Democratic Convention, he appealed to Adlai Stevenson to be Stevenson's running mate. He was not successful, but nevertheless, he was able to make the case that Kennedy on the ticket would not be a drag on the Stevenson ticket in 1956. And there was some thought that John Kennedy, being a happily married man, we thought, would be able to deflect some attention from the fact that Stevenson had been divorced. And so that was part of the reason for the Kennedy camp making that plea. As some of you know, perhaps, Stevenson decided instead to throw the nomination open to the floor. And the delegates to the Democratic National Convention chose Estes Kefauver rather than John Kennedy as Stevenson's running mate in 1956. Nevertheless, Kennedy made himself marketable as a presidential candidate. And as he was thinking more seriously about the 1960 campaign, he had to reckon with the fact that there was still a lot of anti-Catholicism in American life. That had changed from the 28 campaign rather remarkably, in part because of World War II, where Catholic sons of immigrants, many of them, enlisted to fight in World War II, in some cases against the very countries from which their families had migrated. Italy, for example, being one example, Germany being another example. And in 1944, Roman Catholics took advantage of the GI Bill of Rights that allowed them to, as veterans, to get a college education and thereby become upwardly mobile and join the ranks of middle-class American society in large numbers after World War II. So progress was being made. Nevertheless, in 1949, there was a book published called American Freedom and Catholic Power by a man named Paul Blanchard, published by Beacon Press in Boston, Massachusetts. And this book argued about the dangers of a Roman Catholic ever entering the White House. That book went through 11 printings in as many months after it was published in 1949. When I lived in Stephen mentioned, but I taught at Columbia University for 27 years before coming to Dartmouth. And I used to go down to the Strand bookstore, some of you know Strand bookstore, and browse through the religion section. I can't tell you how many copies of American Freedom and Catholic Power I saw on the used bookshelves of Strand bookstore. It was an enormously popular book, and it perpetuated these nativist sentiments about the dangers of Roman Catholicism. What was remarkable about that book, however, is that it was not written by some sort of nativist crank. This was written by Paul Blanchard, who was actually a UCC minister, a graduate of Michigan, Harvard, and Columbia. So he's making these arguments in 1949 that resonated throughout the 1950s. So as Kennedy decided to make his announcement to run for president, which he did, by the way, in January of 1960, gives you a sense of how the primary calendar has expanded so dramatically over the last 5 or 6 decades. He recognized that at some point he probably would have to address the so-called religious issue in that campaign. It came up most memorably for the first time in the West Virginia primary. West Virginia was an overwhelmingly Protestant state. And Kennedy was had still not secured the nomination. And he was up against Hubert Humphrey in that primary campaign. And Hubert Humphrey was campaigning throughout the state. He had a big truck with speakers that would play "Give Me That Old Time Religion" and things like that, in order to emphasize that Humphrey was a Protestant and Kennedy was a Catholic. And Kennedy went on local television in West Virginia to address the issue of his faith. And that, according to Theodore White, I was mixing up Theodore White and Theodore Sorensen, pardon. Theodore White was one of the best television addresses that Kennedy ever gave in the course of his storied career. Kennedy was able to persuade the West Virginia voters to give him a chance. He won that primary. The same day he won the Nebraska primary, and that put him on a glide path to the Democratic nomination. In his victory speech that night in Charleston, he said, "I think we finally put the religious issue behind us." Little did he know. As I was doing research on the book, I came across a letter in the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library up in Boston from Billy Graham to John Kennedy, dated August 20th, 1960. And it was a very congenial letter, as you might imagine. And Graham wrote to Kennedy saying, "Congratulations on your securing the Democratic nomination. There's been a lot of speculation that I, Graham, intend to introduce the religious issue in this campaign. And I want to assure you that even though I will probably vote for my longtime friend, Richard Nixon, I have no intention of introducing the religious issue in this campaign." 8 days later, Graham convened a meeting of American Protestant ministers in Montreux, Switzerland, to strategize about how they could deny Kennedy's election in November. Early in September, November 5th, as I recall. I'm sorry, it's been a while since we read the book, so don't quote me on the dates. A group of Protestant ministers gathered at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. Graham was not there, but Norman Vincent Peale of Marble Collegiate Church in New York City was one of the leaders of this group. It was a closed-door meeting, 150 Protestant ministers. And again, the topic of discussion was how to deny Kennedy's election to the presidency in November. After the meeting, there was a news conference, and the reporters asked, "What did you guys talk about?" All men, of course. And they were candid, saying, "We discussed the dangers of electing a Roman Catholic as president of the United States." Whereupon one of the journalists, plus journalists,
That's right.
Yes.
asked, "Well, Richard Nixon, his Republican opponent, is a Quaker. Quakers have a history of being pacifist. Did you discuss how Nixon's Quakerism might affect his conduct as president?" Whereupon Norman Vincent Peale replied in what I'm sure was an unintentionally funny response. He said, "Well, about Nixon's Quakerism, well, I'm not sure he's ever let it bother him." True enough.
Professor, could I share just one bit from the book that's relevant here?
Please.
the ministers of that time had produced various tracts against Kennedy. And the various tracts said things like, don't let any Catholic convince you that his oath to the state or the government comes first. A Catholic is bound first to his church, even from infancy. Therefore, the church comes first in all things for him. If you elect a Catholic president, he will appoint only Catholics to his cabinet. And within 4 years, America would be under full Catholic control. The Pope wants rich America under Catholic control because all other Catholic countries are poor and always have been. An example of the thoughts of that time.
That's right.
Who wrote that?
That was a tract by some of the ministers, Protestant ministers of that time.
Oh, okay.
And there were a lot of wild theories going around. One was that a Catholic in the White House would annul every Protestant marriage, and things like that. We're circulating. I think the meeting in the Mayflower Hotel finally persuaded the Kennedy camp that they needed to address the issue forthrightly. And so, rather famously, on September 12th, 1960, in the Rice Hotel in Houston, Texas, Kennedy addressed over 300 Protestant ministers, members of the Ministerial Alliance in Houston. It's a remarkable address, and actually I have it, it's one of the appendices in this book. Kennedy opens by saying that a lot of people called me the Catholic candidate for president. He said, no, I'm the Democratic nominee for president who happens to be a Catholic. And he goes on to argue, in effect, that voters should set aside a candidate's faith when they enter the voting booth. And he says, it was quite an eloquent speech, as I'm sure that some of you know or even remember, because he said that this is irrelevant. I believe in the separation of church and state, he said. This is the radical idea these days. We'll get to that later, perhaps. And you know, if voters reject me on the basis of my policies, what I have to say, fine. I'll go back to my seat in the Senate, satisfied that I've been given a fair hearing. But if voters reject me because of my faith, what does that say about America? Essentially, was what he's arguing. And what I contend is that Kennedy's speech was so effective. Not only did it elect him, or at least pave the way for his election as president in 1960, it also introduced an era in American politics that I call the Kennedy paradigm of voter indifference to a candidate's faith. And I'm going to test that theory right now by asking you, what was Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation?
Southern Baptist.
Anybody else? Sorry?
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian, Southern Baptist. My point is, I'll just make my point. You don't know. Because, I'll tell you in a minute.
Of Christ.
Yes. Because Kennedy said, it doesn't matter. We shouldn't pay attention to such things. And I think voters internalized that in the Johnson administration and even into the Nixon administration. And then I'll argue a bit later that all of a sudden after Nixon, it becomes relevant again.
Yeah.
Carter. Because voters wanted to know that their presidents or the presidential candidates had a moral compass after Nixon. And we'll get to that later. But yes, Lyndon Johnson was Disciples of Christ. Again, people don't remember that because it was just not part of the conversation. By the way, he became Disciples of Christ in what appears to be a rebellion against his mother. So there was a woman involved with Johnson. There was always a woman involved, but that was his affiliation. Johnson was a fascinating character, Shakespearean character. I don't know if you're reading Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Johnson. I think it's just utterly superb. And every time a new volume comes out, I go back and reread the others because it's so good. Bill Moyers, Johnson's assistant, once characterized Johnson as 13 of the most fascinating people I ever met. As I was doing research for this book, I kept hearing a story about an evening at the White House. Again, Moyers was one of Johnson's aides. And the Johnson and his aides were working late into the night, as they did frequently. Johnson was tireless. And they decided to have a working dinner. And so before they began eating, Johnson called out to Moyers, who was sitting at the opposite end of the table, and asked Moyers, who of course is an ordained minister, to say a blessing, to say grace. And Moyers began praying. And according to the story, Johnson, in his robust Texan voice, said, "Speak up, Moyers, I can't hear you." Whereupon Bill Moyers, in a quiet, even voice, said, "I wasn't speaking to you, sir." As I was drafting that chapter, I sent a draft to Bill Moyers. And he was very kind. He gave me some good comments, but he also confirmed that story is true. One of that story. So Johnson, of course, had great ambitions. He had inherited a sense from his mother that the strong have an obligation to care for the weak. And that was his moral compass. That was his lodestar. And I think it helps to explain his great society ambitions.
Yeah.
You know, the war on poverty, Medicare, you know, all the things that are part of the great society, he understood as being appropriate because the strong have an obligation to care for the weak.
Because of his teaching career early on also.
That's right.
A real
Yeah, down in
empathy
Cotulla, Texas.
for the-
That's right.
the Vulnerable.
That's right. Yeah.
Lower.
He taught for a brief time, and I think it's Cotulla, Texas, if I remember correctly.
High school, right?
High school, right? And he was captain or the advisor to the debate team, but he had a real soft spot in his heart for, in this case, Hispanic students, and he never lost that. But this principle, the strong have an obligation to care for the weak, he used for domestic policy. Tragically, he also tried to apply it to Vietnam. And that, of course, was his great undoing, is Vietnam. If you look at Johnson's career, and again, I can't recommend the Caro biography strongly enough. Johnson would be remembered throughout history as this towering, extraordinary president, except for Vietnam.
Except for me.
And that was his undoing. Well, Johnson decides, sorry?
Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, well, on the basis of the Gulf and Tonkin resolution, that's right, yeah. You've reminded me, so let me take a little diversion here. Allows me to talk about my next book, which is a biography of Mark Hatfield. Mark Hatfield, as you probably know, was a Republican senator from Oregon from 1966 to 1996, arguably the last liberal Republican in America. Mark Hatfield burst onto the national scene in 1964 when he was the keynote speaker at the Republican National Convention, which nominated Barry Goldwater for president. And in that speech, Mark Hatfield, then the governor of Oregon, condemned the Vietnam War. And he was the only governor in the National Governors Association to vote against a resolution in favor of the Vietnam War, despite Lyndon Johnson putting his pressure on Hatfield to relent. So Hatfield, I think, is a very heroic figure, and I hope to be able to tell his story in the next couple of years. So that's the next project. So Johnson decides, he declares on May 31st, 1968, that he's not going to run for president, not going to run for re-election. That throws everything open. And of course, the person who emerges out of that is Richard Nixon, running again for president in 1968 after having failed in 1960. Richard Nixon wins election to the presidency. This was a troubled time for America, of course. The riots of the Democratic National Convention didn't help. And when Nixon began to take the oath of office, someone pointed out to him that the Constitution does not require him to swear on the Bible. He can simply affirm his oath of office. And in fact, when Herbert Hoover, the only previous Quaker to be elected to the presidency, was sworn in, he affirmed rather than swear, because Quakers have a scruple about swearing. Richard Nixon was informed of this, and it turns out that Richard Nixon had no aversion to swearing. So. to the presidency. Well, you all know what happened during the Nixon years. Things fell apart. Nixon was, of course, very much pushed by Billy Graham. And I'm going to circle back to Mark Hatfield for another moment to remind you that in the final hours before Nixon announced his running mate in 1968, who was, of course, Spiro Agnew, Mark Hatfield was very, very close to being named Nixon's running mate in 1968. Mark Hatfield, who later ended up on Nixon's enemies list, but that's another story.
Who was it, question please, who was it that invited Billy Graham to be a possible running mate?
That I haven't been able to nail that down, but in 1964, and I ran across this at the Johnson Archives in Austin. In 1964, I ran across a second-hand account, so I can't nail it down.
Okay.
That said that Goldwater was considering inviting Graham to be his running mate in 1964, and that Graham was seriously considering.
Billy Graham really considered it.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Again,
Imagine that.
this is a second-hand account, so I can't quite credit it, but
Interesting though.
yes. Yeah, Graham figures into this narrative in several places,
Yes,
as you might imagine. So you remember the Nixon tapes and all this stuff. Graham, you got me prompted here. Some of you remember that when Graham finally read the transcripts of the Watergate tapes, he pronounced himself physically sickened by what he had read.
Yeah.
Not, it turned out, over Graham or Nixon's attempts to subvert the Constitution of the United States, but because of his bad language. Graham was so upset. Okay, so Nixon, of course, resigns on August 8th, 1974, effective at noon the following day, August 9th, 1974. And then his vice president assumes the presidency. His vice president, of course, was born. Anyone know Gerald Ford's given name?
Leslie Lynch Jr.
Very good. Leslie Lynch King Jr., right? Born in Omaha, Nebraska, right? He took the name Gerald Ford from his stepfather. So Gerald Ford, of course, was an Episcopalian. Ray, one for our team here. And very devout by all indications. And it turns out there's a different Billy who begins to visit the White House, not Billy Graham, who had really been tainted by his association with Nixon, but somebody named Billy Zioli. Anybody remember Billy Zioli? No. Billy Zioli was this kind of Rasputin-like figure, a fascinating guy in many ways. And he had known Gerald Ford when Gerald Ford was a member of Congress from Michigan. Zioli was from Michigan as well. And he would send daily devotionals to Gerald Ford in the White House. And these devotionals are in the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor. They all began, "Dear Jerry," and they ended, "Love Z" for Billy Zioli. And then he would offer these sorts of kind of uplifting meditations in order to encourage Gerald Ford in his conduct of the presidency. Gerald Ford, of course, is best known for his pardon of Richard Nixon, his preemptive pardon of Richard Nixon, 1 month, after Gerald Ford took the oath of office. And on Sunday morning, this would have been September 8th, 1974, Gerald Ford went across Lafayette Park to St. John's Episcopal Church. He attended services there, came back, and then addressed the nation about his decision to offer a preemptive pardon to Richard Nixon, at the behest, by the way, of Billy Graham and others. And he said, in part, "I do believe with all my heart, and mind and spirit, that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy." And that was his justification for issuing a pardon to Gerald Ford, or to Richard Nixon, for the Watergate crimes. Historians, the contemporaries, panned the pardon, as you may remember, but I think historians have come around to see that he did probably the right thing, that he he needed to put the Watergate issue behind us as a nation, and this pardon looks better and better through the lens of history. 1976 campaign is fascinating for all sorts of reasons, because a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher decides to run for president of the United States.
Peanut farmer.
And peanut. Jimmy Carter was born again at Plains Baptist Church, as evangelicals all attest to having been born again. And nevertheless, his faith really teetered a bit after the 1966 gubernatorial election in Georgia. Jimmy Carter had risen through the ranks of the Georgia Senate to become leader of the Georgia Senate, and in 1966 he decides to run for governor of Georgia. It's a hard-fought campaign, and he ultimately loses to, of all people, Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox had come to prominence the day after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when Lester Maddox, who ran a restaurant in Atlanta called the Pick Rick Restaurant, met 3 African-American men in the parking lot with an axe handle to prevent them from coming in to dine at his restaurant.
Wow.
And this is what elevated him to something of a celebrity status in Georgia. In fact, he used to sell axe handles in the Pick Rick Restaurant to memorialize his stand against integration. So for Jimmy Carter to lose to, of all people, Lester Maddox in 1966 was a terrible blow to him, because Jimmy Carter was a civil rights pioneer in the South. This triggers a long sort of period of introspection for him. Contemporaries said that he would kind of wander around Plains in the fields with his kind of head down, trying to understand what happened. How could God allow this to happen to him? In the course of his musings, his sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, a Pentecostal evangelist, comes home and has a long conversation with her brother Jimmy, at which time he renews his faith. He rededicates his life to God. Mm-hmm. And that really did change the direction of his life. Shortly thereafter, he went on a mission with other Southern Baptist laymen to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, where they went around literally knocking on doors to tell people about Jesus. The first time I met Jimmy Carter was actually at Emory University before an event. It was a fairly small group. And what he wanted to talk about on that occasion was what he called the unsurpassed joy of talking to people about Jesus. Mm-hmm. He followed up that mission excursion with another one in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he was paired with a Hispanic pastor by the name of Eloy Cruz. And they went around to Hispanic neighborhoods. And Jimmy Carter, with his kind of perfunctory command of Spanish, would read from the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then Pastor Cruz would offer a little bit of meditation. And again, the idea was to invite individuals to have a relationship with Jesus. And Eloy Cruz was pretty persuasive, pretty effective at what he did. Toward the end of the mission trip, Jimmy Carter asked Cruz, he said, "What is the secret to your success? Why do people respond to you?" And Cruz was a very humble man, and he didn't want to answer that question. But Carter kept hammering away. And finally he said, "Senior Jimmy, the secret to faith is to love God in every person who's standing right in front of you." Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Carter took that to heart. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Carter decides then to run for re-election, or run the second time for election as governor of Georgia in 1970. He's successful, part of the whole so-called New South transformation in American politics, the same year that Reuben Askew in Florida and Dale Bumpers in Arkansas were elected governors of their respective states. All of them very congenial to civil rights and to integration. It is at his inaugural address, Jimmy Carter proclaimed to the people of Georgia, the time for racial segregation is over. And that, of course, got a lot of attention. And then Jimmy Carter began to think about running for president himself. The key event occurred in early May 1974, when Carter was a speaker at the Law Day festivities at the University of Georgia Law School. This is a rather important event. Students there invite rather prominent people, Supreme Court justices, attorneys general, and government officials to come address them at Law Day. And in fact, the keynote speaker that day was Edward Kennedy from Massachusetts. And Jimmy Carter, as governor of Georgia, was sort of the undercard speaker. And he begins talking extemporaneously, and he talks about how he came to understand the importance of justice, pursuing justice as a political figure. And he talked about Randall, who famously said that the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. He also talked about the other theologian who had influenced his understanding of justice. And that, of course, was the venerable theologian, Bob Dylan. Particularly Bob Dylan's song, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More, which talks about the plight of tenant farmers. And so Jimmy Carter was talking about this. He went on to talk about other things. And one of the people in the audience was Hunter S. Thompson from Rolling Stone magazine. And Hunter Thompson was quite impressed with what he was hearing from Jimmy Carter. He disappeared briefly from the speech, went out to his car. Carter thought he was simply refreshing whatever beverage he was drinking that day. But he went to get his tape recorder to record something extraordinary. As he said later, a politician willing to tell the truth. And that, when Thompson wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazine, helped to generate enthusiasm for Jimmy Carter. And let's think about the context. Again, this is after Watergate. And all of a sudden, a politician is coming on the scene saying, I will never knowingly lie to the American people. What?
Just to say it, it's amazing.
Lyndon Johnson had lied to us about Vietnam. Richard Nixon had lied to us about
Everything.
pretty much everything.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, a politician says, I'm not gonna lie to you. And you know what? He didn't. You could talk a lot about Jimmy Carter and his presidency, and I'm willing to do so. I wrote a biography of Carter, so I'm happy to do that. But he didn't lie to the American people. And he also sought to act on his religious principles and moral principles. He sought to transform American foreign policy away from the reflexive dualism of the Cold War toward an emphasis on human rights. And in fact, his rhetoric about human rights succeeded in freeing a good number of political prisoners all around the world. He recognized that if America was going to have a foreign policy or good relationships with third world countries, particularly Latin American countries, we needed to do away with our colonialism.
Yeah.
And so he pushed through at great political cost to himself the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaties, which had been set in motion all the way back in the Johnson administration. But he recognized that was essential if we were going to have good relationships with Latin American countries. So he did try to govern according to his principles without crossing that line of separation between church and state. That's a whole other conversation. So what happened? Evangelicals helped to elect Jimmy Carter in 1976, one of their own. And yet they turned dramatically against him 4 years later in favor of Ronald Reagan. On the face of it, not an ideal evangelical candidate. A divorced and remarried man, at that time, that was a huge issue for evangelicals. If you were divorced in evangelical circles at that time, chances are you'd be kicked out of your congregation. A former Hollywood actor, province not known for its piety, and yet evangelicals turned dramatically to Ronald Reagan in 1980. What happened? Well, first we have to acknowledge that Carter's presidency was not going well. Poor Jimmy. 1979 was just a disaster year for Europe. Everything went wrong. You had everything from disco night at Comiskey Park in Chicago to 3 Mile Island, to the taking of the hostages in Iran. It was just disastrous.
The Malay speech.
Yes, that's in the book, yes.
The economy.
The economy, 20%
it's
interest
terrible.
rates,
It's terrible.
the Arab oil embargo, everything was going wrong. So we have to acknowledge that. Nevertheless, why did evangelicals turn so dramatically against Jimmy Carter? Well, the standard narrative, of course, which I'm sure you've heard, is that evangelicals began to mobilize in the 1970s in opposition to the Roe v. Wade ruling of January 22nd, 1973. That is, they were so morally outraged by this Supreme Court decision that they decided to mobilize politically so that they could, in some way or another, reverse that terrible decision. Some of the evangelical leaders even went so far as to characterize themselves as the so-called new abolitionists, trying to link their opposition to abortion to the opposition of 19th century evangelicals to the scourge of slavery. It's a great story. It's been repeated hundreds, if not thousands of times by the leaders of the religious right. It is also absolute fiction. 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicals, convened a conference with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society to discuss the morality of abortion. 26 heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world gathered, discussed the matter over several days. At the end of their gathering, they issued a statement saying, "We can't agree that abortion is morally wrong, but we think it should be available." Two successive editors of Christianity Today magazine, Carl F.H. Henry, the founding editor, and Harold Lindsell, his successor, issued similar statements about the issue of abortion. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, not known as a redoubt of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, a year after Roe v. Wade, again in 1976. W.A. Criswell, one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century, when the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, applauded the Roe v. Wade decision as marking an appropriate distinction between personal behavior and public policy. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. It's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. I call this the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals mobilized politically in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973.
Why did it become such a myth when you say in the book, the real impetus was the revocation of the IRS tax exempt status for some churches that were flouting the law?
Bait and switch is the short
Bait and
answer.
switch.
Yes, so what happens here? What gets
Like
the,
15.
okay,
You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay, I'll try to talk fast.
okay.
So what mobilizes the religious right in the 1970s is not Roe v. Wade, it's a different court decision. It's a court decision that was decided by the District Court for the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1971, a case called Green v. Connolly. I'll try to go quickly here. The background for Green v. Connolly, first of all, is the Board of Education ruling of 1954 that called for the desegregation of public schools. And of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 10 years later. What happened was that in Holmes County, Mississippi, when the schools were beginning to be desegregated, the first year of desegregation, and the number of white students in the public school system dropped from over 700 to 28. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, Mississippi, the number of white students in the public school system dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 segregation academies, church-sponsored, applied to the IRS for tax exempt status. And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this isn't right. So they filed suit. That suit was joined with another suit, has a long judicial history, but anyway, it ends up before the district court for the District of Columbia. And on June 30th, 1971, the same day, by the way, that the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Pentagon Papers. So that's perhaps why it's not well known. On June 30th, 1971, the district court said, any institution that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not by definition a charitable institution. Therefore, it has no claims on tax exempt status. Several people heard that, including Bob Jones University,
Oh,
which since the 1920s had insisted that the Bible mandated racial separation. Also, Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, begun in 1967. Jerry Falwell shortly thereafter made his famous statement. He said, in some states, it's easier to open a massage parlor than it is to open a Christian school. That was the catalyst for the religious right. And by the way, I have all sorts of evidence for it. There's a book right here that will give you everything, including footnotes about that. It's called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. I should know the title.
I highly commend it.
Thank you. Thank you,
Really important
Dr. Martz. I
and
appreciate
and explosive.
it. Thank you.
And we take seriously that thesis. Progress.
Thank you. So that is how the religious right got going. It had nothing to do with abortion. Now, you're going to ask, how did abortion become part of the conversation? Again, I have to compress this. I had a conversation with Paul Weyrich, who's really the architect of the religious right. And he said that I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get evangelicals interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried the pornography issue. I tried the women's rights issue. I tried abortion. Nothing got their attention until the IRS began coming after places like Bob Jones University. He said, that's what got their attention. And then he also said, and Weyrich was very, very cagey. I sometimes call him an evil genius. He was really quite remarkable. He also recognized that even though he got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, he needed another issue that would galvanize grassroots evangelicals. And so what he does in the late 1970s is that he tries various things. And finally, in the midterm elections in 1978, he discovers the issue. And there are 4 Senate races that were particularly crucial. One was in New Hampshire, one was in Iowa. Dick Clark was running for re-election in Iowa, and 2 in Minnesota. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who of course was Carter's vice president. In all 4 of those Senate races, the favored candidates going into the election were the Democratic nominees. But the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, that was a Catholic issue at that point, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 Democratic nominees lost to Republicans. I remember going through Paul Weyrich's papers, which are actually at the University of Wyoming in Laramie for some reason, and coming across this correspondence surrounding that midterm election in 1978. It's almost like the papers started to sizzle because he realized he finally found the issue that would mobilize grassroots evangelicals politically. Even so, when Ronald Reagan in 1980 addressed this huge gathering of evangelicals in Dallas on August 22nd, this is where he famously said, I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing. Brought down the House and arguably sealed the evangelical vote in 1980. I read through his speech, which is out at the Reagan Library. In that speech, he talks about creationism. He excoriates the IRS and Jimmy Carter for their unconstitutional regulatory agenda against segregated schools. He doesn't say segregated, but that's what he's talking about. He didn't mention abortion even once in that speech. August of 1980. So that's the longer story. I won't get to the rest of the book, I'm sure.
Sure.
About how evangelicals turned so dramatically against Jimmy Carter in favor of Ronald Reagan in 1980. I tell the story a little bit more fully in this book. Yeah.
But that's a good segue,
yeah, please.
Professor, to the, we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to be able to ask folks for questions, if
please.
that's okay.
Yes, that's
But
fine.
let me throw that out, a question about, what do you think of the religious right today? What is the religious right today? And how have they, because we don't hear about moral majority or specific names of these organizations, but the Supreme Court has obviously turned more conservative. And so who's behind the religious right and conservative movement today? In 8 minutes, please.
Yeah. First of all, I highly recommend a new documentary on Hulu called God Forbid.
God forbid.
God Forbid.
Okay.
You'll see a familiar face as part of the documentary, but if that documentary is to be believed, Donald Trump's emergence as president with the election of 2016 can be traced to Jerry Falwell Jr.'s wife's dalliance with a pool boy from Miami, Florida. And they make a pretty persuasive case in that documentary. The larger picture, I think, is, and I've been trying to figure this out myself for a while. I think the 2016 election allowed the religious right to finally drop the pretense that this was a movement about family values. You just can't make that argument and support Donald Trump. It just, you just can't make that argument.
Yeah.
And I contend that this election allowed the religious right to circle back to the charter principle in its movement, in the movement itself, which is baked into the movement, and that is racism. Now, that's not to say that evangelicals are racist, or certainly that all evangelicals are racist. I won't make that charge. I never made that charge, even though I've been accused of saying that. I haven't said that. But it seems to me that if you have a movement that is born out of racist motives, that is the defense of racial segregation in evangelical institutions, and you don't repent of that in any way, but the leaders of this movement. My sense as a historian is that unrepented racism tends to fester, and it doesn't go away. As I was writing that book, it really became clear to me that the bridge figure between the origins of the religious right and Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan became active in California politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which sought to guarantee equal access to both rental housing as well as the purchase of housing. He actively opposed both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he frequently invoked that racially charged moniker, law and order. And I expect I'm not the only person in this room who remembers his vile characterization of so-called welfare queens, women of color who are feeding off the public dole and living lives of luxury. And for me, the clincher is the fact that Ronald Reagan opened his general election campaign for the presidency on August 3rd, 1980, in, of all places, the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers. And lest Reagan, of course, was the master of symbolism. Lest anyone miss his intent, he invoked that age-old segregationist battle cry, "I believe in states' rights." So I think the bridge figure between the origins of the religious right and Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan.
Interesting. Okay. Who had a question? Jim?
Well, I had never thought of this before, but hearing you talk about the progression of it, stimulates my question. is there anything in the evangelical movement of the sixties and seventies that would support these, any theological things that would support their action? Or are they riding on the facts that there is an awful lot of racism that exists, and this is a way for them to increase their constituency because they were struggling with their constituency? In other words, instead of going from the principle to the fact, they're going from the fact. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, the evangelicals were not politically mobilized, really in the middle decades of the 20th century, roughly from the Scopes trial in 1925 to Carter's campaign in 75. Many of them not even registered to vote. And I can talk about the reasons for that. It probably needs a different session to get to that. But they weren't mobilized. In the early 1970s, there's actually a remarkable event that occurs in Chicago at the YMCA on Wabash Avenue in Chicago, where a group of 55 evangelicals get together and they craft something called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, which you can look up on the internet. It's available. 1973 version. Make sure it's that version. What's remarkable about that document is that it seeks to reclaim the social ethic of 19th and early 20th century evangelicals. People think of evangelicalism as being, hard right wing because of the religious right. But if you go into the history, and I'm a historian, go back in the 19th century, evangelicals were at the forefront of women's equality, for example. They were very much involved in the abolitionist movement in the North. There were Southern defenders of slavery. I'm not going to deny that. They were very much involved in prison reform. They were very much involved in the emergence of public education, known as common schools at that time, because they recognized, and they're explicit about this, this is the way for those on the lower rungs of society to become upwardly mobile and to join the middle class.
so this is the late 1800s and early 19th.
Early 19th century, yeah, and workers' rights,
19th century.
early 20th century, 19th and early 20th century, yeah. Workers' rights around the turn of the 20th century, for example. So you have that. And then you have the election of Jimmy Carter. So in many ways, this is the heyday for progressive evangelicalism in the early part of the 1970s. And then it all goes south with this, what happens with the emergence of the religious right.
Well, that's the thing that always gets me about evangelicals, is that these people really profess to be very strong Christians.
Yes.
And yet I don't hear anything coming out of their preaching that would found a foundation in scripture or in theological things or anything like that. I don't find anything in what they are saying that is based on Christianity.
Well, it's not in their churches though, is it? It's almost as if it's an organization aside from the church.
It is, yeah, that's
Because
right.
the numbers of the churches that are evangelical are down.
Yeah, they're going down, yeah. they are
So
going
it's not like it's the church. It's like it's a side organization, using the evangelical terminology.
Yeah.
Harvey.
Who was it who said the religious right is neither?
I'm sorry, is it?
The religious right is neither.
Neither, yeah, religious rights. Neither. Well,
I had a
I think they
question.
said that about moral majority. Moral majority is neither, right? Yeah.
I do have a question.
Okay, just a couple of minutes left. Harvey and then Mark and then Eric.
Well, as I said, I just can't say good enough things about the book. That is, I got it in a couple of days from Amazon, so I encourage you. And
You should listen to your pastor.
Yeah. You've seen, we're in the presence of one of the giants in religion and history in America, and I'm just so honored that we're able to have Dr. Balmer with us. I have a simple question. What's the proper relationship between church and state?
I think the First Amendment is America's best idea.
Yes.
And it was unprecedented. The idea of forming a government without the interlocking support of religion. And
I just want to say that is in the Constitution.
of course it is.
I just read it the other day.
Yes.
I'm very concerned
The
about
amendments
all
are.
of this, and there is a separation of church and state, and that has to be implemented not only through our society, but in our schools. So,
That phrase is not in
I-
the Constitution.
yes.
No, you're absolutely right.
Court opinion.
All right, the phrase, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution.
No.
But Thomas
Danbury-
Jefferson,
Danbury Baptist.
so the letter to the
In the amendments.
Danbury Baptist on January 2nd, 1802, pardon me. That is what, that's what really clinches the argument. But and this is what I don't understand about the current political situation. My sense as a historian is that religion has flourished in this country precisely because the separation of church and state. It set up a free marketplace for religion where all religious groups can compete with one another. You have a vibrant religious marketplace. And this whole, I know we're out of time.
That's okay.
The whole metaphor for the separation of church and state comes from Roger Williams, who's the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. And Roger Williams, and this is very important, people miss this. Roger Williams wanted to separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. Now we have to go back into the 17th century and understand what he meant by that. Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, they didn't share our post-Thoreauvian romance with wilderness.
Oh.
Right? Wilderness for them was a place of darkness where evil lurked. So when he wants to protect the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, what he's trying to say is that we need to keep these two entities separate in order to protect the integrity of the faith from too much intersection with the church. I'll give you a quick example of this. I was one of the expert witnesses in the Alabama 10 Commandments case. You probably remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Roy Moore plopped this 2.5-ton granite monument in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery. And, I'm not going to get into my testimony, but you can probably imagine what I had to say. But when Judge Thompson ruled correctly that the monument violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, particularly because Roy Moore said he didn't want any other religious representations in that place. He turned them all down, including the petition from the Alabama Humanist Association, both members, no doubt. But and Judge Thompson ordered the monument moved. One of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God."
Oh, wow.
Unless I miss my guess, one of those commandments says something about a graven image, right?
Yes,
And that was precisely Roger Williams' point.
yes.
If you allow the coalescence of church and state, you ultimately trivialize the faith. And that to me is the greater worry.
Didn't he found Rhode Island?
He did.
Dr. Williams?
Yeah, yeah. As a haven for religious liberty.
Yes.
I wish we could go on and take more questions, but we really have to wrap up because Dr. Balmer needs to start talking in 10 minutes in fellowship
Oh, is that
hall.
right?
You gotta give him time.
About sports, yes, sports and religion and
Tim Tebow.
the connection there. So another good presentation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Balmer, for your.
Yes.